Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, let the day soften around you, and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Human Wish to Keep Memory. In the quiet of an ancient evening, before there were shelves of books or rooms made especially for reading, people gathered close and remembered together. A voice might speak a poem, a law, a prayer, or the names of ancestors. Others listened carefully, holding the words in mind. By firelight, beneath a wide, dark sky, memory lived in breath and rhythm, in repeated phrases, in songs learned slowly and passed from one generation to the next. Long before libraries became places with scrolls, tablets, or manuscripts, human beings found ways to keep what mattered. They told stories again and again so they would not fade. They recited sacred words in a careful order, with familiar pauses and tones. They marked stone, painted signs on walls, carved symbols into bone or wood, and shaped small objects that stood for goods, numbers, or promises. These early acts were not libraries in the modern sense, but they belonged to the same deep wish, the wish to place memory somewhere safe. A library today may bring to mind a public building with open doors, quiet tables, and books arranged by subject. In the ancient world, things were often different. Many collections were not open to everyone. Some belonged to temples, where priests and trained writers kept ritual texts, hymns, and records of offerings. Some belonged to palaces, where officials stored messages, laws, accounts, and lists of land or grain. Others were kept in schools, where young scribes practiced writing and copied useful texts. A scribe was a trained writer or copyist, someone who knew how to shape words in the writing system of a particular time and place. There were also private scholarly collections gathered by people with learning, wealth, or official duties. These might contain poetry, letters, histories, medical knowledge, or instructions for rituals. Yet the boundary between a library and an archive was often soft and blurred. An archive is a place where records are kept. A palace room filled with tax accounts might be called an archive. A temple storeroom containing prayers, calendars, and learned writings might feel more like a library. In many ancient places, the same collection could preserve both practical records and treasured words. Before writing, memory was not weak or simple. Oral traditions could be exact, refined, and powerful. People trained their minds to remember long works with great care. A story could be held in the patterns of verse. A teaching could be protected by ritual repetition. A law could be spoken in a public gathering and kept alive through custom. Writing did not replace these living forms of memory. It joined them, adding another way for human thought to travel through time. Writing developed in more than one region of the world, and not always for the same reasons. In some places, it grew from the need to count goods, record trade, or manage fields and storehouses. In others, it became closely connected with religion, royal power, law, or learning. A mark could show how many jars of oil were owed. A sign could name a person, a temple, or a city. A sequence of signs could preserve a prayer, a royal command, or a tale once carried by the voice. Imagine a small clay token resting in the palm of a hand. It may stand for a sheep, a measure of grain, or a jar of beer. Such tokens were used in parts of the ancient Near East before full writing systems took shape. They helped people count and remember exchanges. Later, signs impressed into clay could do more than count. They could name, describe, record, and eventually tell. In this gradual movement from object to mark, from mark to word, memory found new containers. Those containers were many and varied. Some early records rested in baskets. Others were placed in jars, stacked in niches, tied in bundles, or stored in wooden boxes. A temple might have a shaded room where records were kept away from damp and disturbance. A palace might have storerooms where officials could find older accounts. A school might keep practice tablets for students learning the careful shapes of writing. These were not always grand places. Sometimes they were practical rooms made of mud brick or wood, filled with the quiet work of keeping order. As collections grew, people needed ways to find what had been stored. They grouped records by purpose, owner, date, subject, or series. They placed labels on containers or added notes to texts. A catalog is an organized list of texts or records. a guard to what a collection holds. Ancient catalogs did not look the same everywhere, and many have not survived, but the idea is very old. When memory grows large, it needs pathways through it. The materials themselves shaped what could be remembered. Clay could last for thousands of years, especially when hardened by heat. Stone could preserve a public inscription in open air, but many other materials were more fragile. Wood can rot, leather can decay, bark, leaves, and papyrus can be eaten by insects or softened by damp air. A manuscript, meaning a handwritten text, might once have rested safely in a temple or household and still vanish without a trace when its material wore away. What survives from the ancient world is therefore only part of what once existed. This is one of the gentle lessons of ancient libraries. Survival is uneven. Some ordinary records have endured in great numbers because they were written on durable clay. Some famous poems have disappeared because their copies were made on fragile materials. Some works are known only because another writer mentioned them. The past is not a single complete shelf. It is more like a quiet room where some lamps are still glowing and others have gone out. Yet even in what remains we can sense the patience of many hands. Someone smoothed the surface for writing. Someone shaped a reed into a pen or stylus. Someone repeated a line until it was correct. Someone returned a tablet to its place, tied a bundle, closed a jar, or set a record into a niche in the wall. These small acts were part of the keeping of memory. Across many lands and centuries, people gathered what they needed to remember: accounts of harvests, names of kings, hymns for festivals, instructions for healing, observations of stars, poems, stories, and rules for living together. They did not all call these gatherings libraries. They did not all arrange them in the same way, but again and again they made places where words and records could rest. And so our journey begins not with one first library, but with a shared human gesture: to notice that memory is precious, and to protect it. In the stillness of an early storeroom, a basket may hold clay counters, a jar may shelter records, a wooden container may keep a fragile writing safe for another season. Nearby, on a low surface, damp clay waits beside a reed stylus, smooth and ready. In that quiet beginning, we can already feel the path leading toward the mud brick rooms of Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest written collections were pressed, sign by sign, into clay. Chapter 2: Clay Tablets of Mesopotamia. In the warm light of an ancient morning, a small tablet of damp clay rests in a scribe's hand. Its surface has been smoothed with care, flat enough to receive marks, but still soft enough to remember them. Beside it lies a reed stylus, cut at an angle. When the stylus touches the clay, it does not draw a flowing line. It presses a small wedge into the surface, then another and another, until the quiet tablet begins to hold a message. This kind of writing is called cuneiform, a word that means wedge-shaped. It was made by pressing the end of a stylus into clay, leaving marks that could stand for words, sounds, or ideas. Cuneiform began in southern Mesopotamia around the late 4th millennium BCE. At first, much of it served practical needs: counting goods, recording grain, noting animals, listing deliveries, and keeping track of labor. These were not books in the modern sense, and the rooms that held them were often more like archives. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a region of cities, fields, canals, temples, and palaces. Such a world needed memory. A jar of oil given to a temple, a field assigned to a worker, a payment of silver, a legal agreement between families. All these things could be set down on clay. The tablet became a small shelter against forgetting. Clay was close at hand. It could be gathered from riverbanks and shaped in the palm. Some tablets were tiny, no larger than a few fingers. Others were broad and heavy. A scribe could write on one side, then turn the tablet and continue on the other. When the writing was done, the tablet might be dried in the sun. Some tablets were intentionally fired, becoming harder and more durable. Others survived by accident, when fires in buildings baked the clay and preserved it for later centuries. In this way, moments of daily life became unexpectedly long-lasting. The rooms that held these tablets were not always quiet reading rooms as we might imagine today. They were storerooms, offices, school spaces, temple chambers, or palace archives. Tablets could be kept in baskets, jars, boxes, or on shelves. Some were grouped by subject, or by office. Some carried labels or brief notes to help identify their contents. A tablet might have a catchline, a line at the end that points toward the next tablet in a series. Others had a colophon, a closing note that could name the scribe, the owner, the series, or other useful details. Yet organization varied from place to place. Each collection answered the needs of its own community. In temple archives, writing helped manage offerings, lands, workers, rituals, and stores of goods. Temples were sacred places, and they were also important economic and administrative centers. In palace archives, officials kept letters, treaties, accounts, and orders. In schools, young scribes copied exercises, again and again, learning the shapes of signs and the habits of careful writing. They made word lists, copied model contracts, solved mathematical problems, and practiced the orderly work that writing required. Among the most common school texts were lexical lists. A lexical list is a word list, arranged to help students learn vocabulary, signs, and meanings. Some lists named animals, trees, professions, vessels, stones, or cities. They may seem simple, but they show a deep wish to arrange the world in language. A student could sit with a tablet on a lap, copying columns of signs, learning not only how to write, but how to classify and remember. Other tablets carried legal documents, sales, marriages, adoptions, loans, inheritances, and agreements witnessed by named people. Some held letters with voices reaching across distance. There were accounts and receipts, plain and precise, recording barley, wool, oil, livestock, silver, and labor. These practical records form a large part of what survives, and they remind us that libraries and archives often began with ordinary needs. But Mesopotamian tablet collections also preserved hymns, prayers, wisdom writings, rituals, and stories. Some tablets held omen texts, writings that interpreted signs believed to predict events. Others recorded medical treatments, astronomical observations, mathematical exercises, and lists of scholarly knowledge. There were myths and epics as well, works that carried memory in another way. Through clay, the practical and the poetic rested side by side. Across Mesopotamia and neighboring regions, archaeologists have found large numbers of tablets at ancient sites. Nippur, Mari, Ebla, Babylon, and Nineveh have all yielded important tablet finds. Each site offers a different window. Some show the work of officials. Some show the training of scribes. Some preserve religious and scholarly traditions. Together they do not form one single library, neatly arranged from the beginning. Instead, they show many rooms of memory, each shaped by its place and purpose. A scribe's work required patience. The clay had to be prepared at the right softness. The signs had to be pressed in the proper order. If the tablet was too wet, marks blurred. If it was too dry, the surface resisted. A mistake might be smoothed away while the clay was still fresh, or a new tablet might be made. Finished tablets were set aside to dry, their wedge marks catching the light. In a courtyard, rows of pale clay might rest beneath the sun. In a mud brick room, tablets might cool in shadow, waiting to be read, checked, stored, or copied. The weight of clay mattered. A collection of tablets was not light or easily moved. Knowledge here had substance. It could be stacked, carried in baskets, sealed in jars, or arranged on shelves, but always with effort. To read a tablet was to hold a piece of earth, shaped by human attention. The marks were small, but the object itself was firm, quiet, and durable. Over time, many tablets broke. Many were lost. Many remain only as fragments, with part of a line, part of a name, part of a story. Yet even fragments can speak softly. A broken account may tell us what grain was stored. A school exercise may show how a young writer learned. A line of poetry may preserve a voice older than many cities now standing. The clay does not give us everything, but it gives us enough to sense the patient keeping of memory. As the day lowers over Mesopotamia, the archive rooms grow cooler. Baskets and shelves hold tablets marked with accounts, prayers, lists, letters, and stories. The small wedges lie still in the clay, as if resting after their long journey through time. From these many rooms of Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria, the path of memory leads gently northward, toward Nineveh, where one royal collection would gather thousands of tablets into a library remembered across the ages. Chapter 3. The Library of Ashurbanipal. In the quiet rooms of an ancient palace, clay tablets once rested in rows, their small wedge-shaped marks catching the low light. Some tablets were pale like dry earth. Others were darker, touched by age and by the long journey of time. Each one could be held in the hand, yet each carried words from a world of scholars, scribes, priests, officials, and poets. This was Nineveh, an ancient Assyrian city near the Tigris River, close to modern Mosul in Iraq. In the 7th century BCE, it was one of the great centers of the Assyrian kingdom. Among its palace spaces was a remarkable royal collection of clay tablets, now known as the Library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was king of Assyria in the 7th century BCE. Like many kings of the ancient Near East, he gathered records, inscriptions, and learned texts. But he is especially remembered because he presented himself as a ruler with scholarly training. In royal inscriptions, he claimed knowledge of scribal arts, difficult texts, and the wisdom preserved in cuneiform writing. This was unusual. Kings often described their strength, their building projects, or their devotion to the gods. Ashurbanipal also described himself as someone who could read and understand learned tablets. The library that bears his name was not a single room like a modern library, with open shelves and visitors moving quietly from aisle to aisle. It was a complex royal collection, spread through palace areas, archives, and storerooms. Some tablets belonged to series of scholarly works. Some were copies made from older tablets. Some were official records or royal inscriptions. Together they formed one of the most important surviving collections from the ancient world. The tablets were written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script used for many languages of Mesopotamia. A scribe made these marks by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay. In skilled hands, this simple tool could make signs of great precision. Line by line, the scribe pressed the signs into the damp surface. When the tablet dried, the writing became firm. Some tablets were small and compact. Others were larger, with many columns of text. In the palace collection, there were scholarly texts, omen texts, rituals, medical writings, lexical lists, myths and epics, and royal inscriptions. A lexical list was a kind of word list, used for learning, reference, and the careful study of language. Omen texts recorded signs that learned specialists believed could help interpret events. Medical texts described symptoms, treatments, and observations in the language of their time. Ritual texts preserved words and actions for religious ceremonies. These were not all stories or poems. Many were practical, technical, or sacred works, made for trained readers. The Library of Ashurbanipal preserved important copies of works such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. This ancient Mesopotamian literary work tells of Gilgamesh, a legendary king, and of his friendship, journeys, grief, and search for wisdom. The versions found among the tablets and fragments from Nineveh helped modern scholars recover one of the oldest great works of literature known today. Its survival reminds us that a tablet resting quietly in a storeroom may carry a voice across thousands of years. Many tablets included a colophon. A colophon is a note, often placed at the end of a text, that gives information about the tablet. It might name the owner, the scribe, the series to which the tablet belonged, or the place of the tablet within a larger work. Such notes helped organize knowledge. They also give modern readers small glimpses into ancient systems of care. A colophon might tell us that a tablet was copied from an older exemplar, meaning the model text used by the scribe. It might preserve the name of a person whose careful writing still remains. The work of copying required patience. A scribe might sit with an older tablet nearby, studying each line before pressing new marks into fresh clay. The task was not only to reproduce signs, but to preserve meaning. A broken passage, an unclear sign, or a difficult word required attention. Some texts belonged to long series, and the order mattered. A tablet could be one part of a larger whole. In such a place, one can imagine the day slowly passing. Officials come and go. A scribe smooths damp clay with the palm of the hand. Another reads from an older tablet in a measured voice. The reed stylus presses softly, leaving wedges in ordered rows. Tablets dry nearby, waiting to be stored. Labels, notes, and repeated lines help keep the collection arranged. The palace grows quieter as evening comes, and the tablets remain, holding their words in stillness. The modern discovery of this collection came much later. In the 19th century, archaeologists excavating at Nineveh uncovered large numbers of tablets and fragments from the palace areas. They found not just a few texts, but tens of thousands of pieces, many broken, many scattered, and many requiring long study. A great number of these tablets and fragments are now held in the British Museum. Their reconstruction has been a careful and continuing task. Scholars compare fragments, identify handwriting styles, match lines of text, and place small pieces back into larger works where possible. The survival of the Library of Ashurbanipal is connected, in part, to a difficult moment in Nineveh's history. The city was destroyed near the end of the Assyrian Empire, and fires in the palace areas baked some of the clay tablets harder, helping them endure beneath the ruins. This is a quiet irony of preservation. Clay that might have crumbled was strengthened by heat, then buried and kept out of sight for many centuries. It is enough to note this gently, without lingering there. What matters for our walk through the ancient library is that the tablets remained, and that their words could be read again. The Library of Ashurbanipal does not stand alone as the first library, nor does it represent every kind of ancient collection. Earlier temples, palaces, and schools had kept tablets before it. Other cities had archives of their own. But Nineveh's royal collection is extraordinary because so much of it survived, and because it gathered scholarly traditions from across Mesopotamia. It was a place where older knowledge was copied, arranged, and brought into royal care. In its small clay surfaces, many voices rested together. The voice of a scholar listing words, the voice of a healer describing illness, the voice of a ritual specialist preserving sacred speech, the voice of a poet shaping an ancient tale, and the voice of a scribe adding a colophon at the end of a long day. Each tablet was heavy compared with a sheet of papyrus or parchment, yet each was light enough to carry memory forward. As the palace rooms grow still in the imagination, the tablets remain at rest. Their wedge marks lie close together like tiny shadows in clay. The shelves and baskets are quiet. The work of careful hands has paused until morning, and from this world of clay, of weight and impressed signs, the path of ancient libraries will soon soften into another texture. Reeds by the Nile, ink on pale papyrus, and scrolls resting in shaded rooms. Chapter 4: Scrolls Beside the Nile. Beside the Nile, where the water moved in a slow green ribbon through the dry land, tall papyrus reeds grew in the shallows. Their stems rose straight and smooth from the mud, and their feathery tops opened lightly in the warm air. Sunlight rested on the water. Along the river banks, people had long known that this plant could become a surface for writing. After the heavier world of clay tablets, papyrus feels light and flowing. A clay tablet could rest in the palm like a small piece of earth. A papyrus roll was different. It could be carried under the arm, tied with a cord, unrolled across a table, and filled with lines of ink. In ancient Egypt, papyrus became one of the great writing materials of the world. It helped shape the way records, stories, prayers, and learned texts were made and kept. To make papyrus, workers cut the inner pith of the papyrus stem into thin strips. These strips were laid side by side, then another layer was placed across them at right angles. The layers were pressed together, and the natural juices of the plant helped bind them. After drying, the sheet could be smoothed and joined to other sheets, making a long roll. The result was pale, flexible, and light. It held ink well, and it could be rolled closed when the writing was finished. A scribe might sit with a reed pen, made from a cut stem, and an ink palette nearby. Egyptian scribes often used black ink for the main writing, and red ink for headings, corrections, important words, or divisions in a text. The palette, with its small wells of color, was both a tool and a symbol of learning. A trained hand could make signs that curved and flowed, or signs that stood more formally, depending on the script and the purpose of the document. Scribes were important in Egyptian society. They copied, counted, recorded, and preserved. In administrative offices, they wrote accounts of grain, labor, livestock, taxes, land, and goods moving from one place to another. In royal and elite settings, scribes prepared letters, lists, decrees, and records connected with the work of government. In scribal schools, students learned to form signs, copy model texts, and practice the careful discipline of writing. Not every ancient Egyptian written collection was a library in the modern sense. Many were archives, places where records were kept. Some collections were practical, arranged for officials who needed to find accounts, or legal documents. Others belonged to temples, where writing was connected with ritual, learning, medicine, and sacred knowledge. There were also royal and elite collections kept by people with wealth, status, and education. Within Egyptian temple life, there were institutions known as houses of life. The Egyptian name is often translated this way, and it suggests a place linked to learning, ritual, and the preservation of important texts. A house of life was not exactly a library as we might imagine one today. Its details varied from period to period and from temple to temple. But such institutions were associated with scribes, priests, copying, religious knowledge, medical writings, and learned traditions. They remind us that in ancient Egypt, writing could be practical and sacred, administrative, and deeply connected to the order of the world. In shaded temple rooms, scrolls may have rested in boxes, jars, chests, or niches, tied with cords and perhaps labeled for recognition. The air would have been dry and dimmer than the brightness outside. A reed pen might be laid beside an ink palette. A roll might be opened for copying, study, or ritual use, then rolled again and returned to its place. The keeping of memory depended on such simple, repeated movements: untying, reading, copying, tying, storing. Egyptian texts covered many subjects. Religious works preserved hymns, prayers, ritual instructions, and teachings about the gods. Funerary texts were writings connected with burial and the afterlife. Some were placed in tombs to accompany the dead, offering words of protection and guidance. Medical papyri recorded treatments, observations, and remedies. Mathematical texts included problems involving measurement, distribution, and calculation. Administrative records kept track of the practical work of a complex society. There were also literary tales and wisdom literature. Wisdom texts offered advice about proper conduct, speech, learning, and life in society. Literary tales could carry imagination, instruction, and reflection. These writings show that Egyptian written culture was not only about accounts or ceremony. It also held stories, teachings, and thoughtful words passed from one generation to another. Yet papyrus, for all its usefulness, was fragile. It could be damaged by dampness, insects, handling, and time. Unlike clay, it did not usually survive unless conditions were kind. Egypt's dry climate helped preserve many papyri, especially in tombs, desert settlements, and other places protected from moisture. Much of what survives today comes from such dry settings, not always from the original rooms where texts were first stored or used. This means that our picture of Egyptian libraries and archives is partial. We see what the desert allowed to remain. Still, what remains is rich. A single papyrus roll can carry the voice of a scribe, a healer, a priest, a storyteller, or a teacher. A list of supplies can show the rhythms of work. A hymn can reveal devotion. A student's copy can show the quiet labor of learning. A medical text can preserve careful attention to the human body. A mathematical problem can show the orderly habits of calculation. Each piece is a small shelter against forgetting. Imagine then a warm afternoon near the Nile. Reeds move gently beside the water. Somewhere sheets of papyrus dry in the sun, turning pale and smooth. In a shaded room, a scribe dips a reed pen into black ink. Red ink waits beside it in a small well. A scroll lies open, and the signs gather slowly across its surface. When the work is done, the roll is allowed to dry, then carefully wound, tied with a cord, and placed in the shade. From such rolls, Egyptian memory traveled. Some remained in temples, offices, schools, tombs, and houses. Some were copied again. Some were lost to dampness, handling, or the ordinary passing of years. Others rested in dry silence until much later eyes found them. And in the imagination, one papyrus roll may travel northward, beyond the river, and toward the sea, where the Mediterranean opens wide, and where Alexandria would one day gather scrolls from many lands into one of antiquity's most famous centers of learning. Chapter 5. The Great Library of Alexandria. Along the edge of the Mediterranean, where the sea air moved softly through bright streets and shaded colonnades, Alexandria rose in pale stone beside the water. Ships came and went from its harbors, carrying grain, glass, oil, letters, and stories. Within the city were courtyards where scholars could walk slowly, speaking of poems, numbers, stars, and the careful shapes of words. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, at the western edge of the Nile Delta. After Alexander's death, Egypt came under the rule of the Ptolemies, a Greek-speaking dynasty that made Alexandria their capital. Under their patronage, the city became one of the great centers of the Hellenistic world. Hellenistic means the period after Alexander, when Greek language and culture spread through many regions of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and Western Asia, mixing with older local traditions in complex ways. In this city, the famous Great Library of Alexandria took shape. It was not a public library in the modern sense with open doors for all readers. It was connected with the Mouseion, a royal scholarly institution dedicated to the Muses. The Muses were Greek goddesses associated with poetry, music, history, astronomy, and other arts of learning. A Mouseion then was a place for those arts to be honored and studied. The word gives us museum, though the ancient Mouseion was less like a modern museum and more like a community of scholars supported by the royal court. The library flourished especially during the Ptolemaic period. Its collection was made mainly of papyrus scrolls, rolled neatly or stored in cases and shelves. A scroll might carry poetry, drama, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, history, or a treatise on the movements of the heavens. Some scrolls had small tags tied to them, giving the author's name or the title of the work. In a quiet room, a scholar could choose a roll, loosen its cord, and open it carefully, column by column, as the black ink appeared on the pale surface. Ancient traditions say that the Ptolemies wished to gather texts from across the Greek-speaking world and beyond. The exact size of the library is uncertain, and ancient numbers should be treated with care. They may reflect admiration as much as measurement. Still, the ambition was remarkable. Alexandria was imagined as a place where many writings could be brought together, compared, copied, organized, and studied. It was a shelter for memory, supported by royal wealth and by the patient work of scholars and scribes. In the library and the Mouseion, scholars worked with texts in a detailed and attentive way. They compared one copy of a poem with another, noticing differences between lines or words. They studied grammar, the rules and habits of language. They practiced philology, which means the careful study of words, texts, and their histories. A philologist might ask which version of a passage seemed oldest, or why one word was used instead of another. Such work was quiet and exacting, suited to long tables, ink-darkened fingers, and minds willing to move slowly. One important Alexandrian scholar was Callimachus, a poet and learned organizer of books. He is associated with the Penakes, a great bibliographic work. A bibliography is an organized list of writings, and the Penakes seems to have arranged authors and works into categories, helping scholars understand what the library held. It was not simply a shelf list in the modern sense, and it has not survived whole. Yet its memory suggests how important cataloging had become. To collect many scrolls was one task, to find them again was another. Another scholar connected with Alexandria was Eratosthenes. He studied geography, poetry, mathematics, and astronomy. He is especially remembered for estimating the circumference of the Earth with impressive accuracy for his time. His work reminds us that the library was not only a storehouse of old poems, it was also a place where observation, calculation, and imagination could meet. Aristarchus of Samothrace became known for his careful study of Homer. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, had long histories in oral performance and written copies. By the time they were studied in Alexandria, different versions and readings existed. Aristarchus examined the poems with great care, marking doubtful lines and considering how the text might best be understood. In this way, the library helped shape the versions of ancient literature that later generations would inherit. Euclid is also traditionally associated with Alexandria. He is known for the Elements, a foundational work of geometry. The exact relationship between Euclid and the Great Library is uncertain, but his connection with Alexandrian learning fits the wider picture of the city as a place where mathematical thought was valued and taught. In the calm order of geometry, with its definitions and proofs, one can almost imagine the same spirit of arrangement that guided the catalogs and scroll rooms. Alexandrian scholars worked in many fields: poetry, medicine, astronomy, geography, grammar, and textual study. Some examined the human body and illness. Some mapped lands and seas. Some studied the stars. Others shaped poems of their own, drawing on the written traditions around them. The library was not one mind, but many minds working near one another, each adding a small light to the shared room of knowledge. The later history of the great library is less clear than its fame. It is often said that it was destroyed in one great fire, and that ancient knowledge vanished in a single night. The real story was probably more gradual. Fires, political changes, shifting royal support, wars, neglect, and the changing life of Alexandria may all have played a part over time. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE may have damaged books or storehouses, but the extent is debated. Later events may also have affected scholarly institutions in the city. The evidence is incomplete, and it is best to speak gently where certainty is lacking. What remains most vivid is not only the story of loss, but the image of careful work. Scrolls were gathered, copied, compared, listed, and read. Names were arranged, lines of poetry were weighed, measurements of the earth were calculated under the same wide sky that lay above the harbor. In the shaded rooms of Alexandria, the keeping of memory became a royal project, a scholarly craft, and a quiet daily practice. As evening settled over the city, the sea beyond the colonnades would darken from blue to silver. The papyrus rolls rested in their cases, their labels still and their cords gently tied. Far across the eastern Mediterranean, another city of learning rose on its hillside, Pergamon, where pale parchment would offer a different surface for the written word. Chapter 6. Pergamon and the Art of Parchment. Warm light rests softly on the pale surface of a prepared sheet, smooth beneath careful hands. It is not quite paper, and not papyrus. It has a faint ivory tone, a gentle strength, and a quiet flexibility. A scribe bends over it with a pen, and the ink settles into letters that may be read, copied, and carried for many years. Around him are wooden cases, rolled texts, folded sheets, and the stillness of a room made for learning. This is Pergamon, an ancient city in Western Asia Minor, in the land that is now modern Turkey. It rose on a high hill above the surrounding plain, with terraces, temples, colonnades, and rooms that caught the changing light of the day. From its heights, one could look outward across roads and valleys toward the wider Hellenistic world. Pergamon became a place of culture and learning under the Attalid kings, a dynasty that supported art, architecture, scholarship, and institutions of learning. Ancient writers speak of Pergamon as having an important library. Sometimes they describe it as a rival to the great library in Alexandria. It is wise to hold this idea gently. Rivalry may have existed in some form, for rulers often wished their cities to be known as centers of wisdom and refinement. Yet the details are not fully clear. We do not know the exact size of Pergamon's collection, nor do we know all of its contents or how its rooms were arranged. In such a place, texts would have rested in order, scrolls in cases, labels attached to help identify them, copies made for scholars, teachers, and officials. The library may have held poetry, philosophy, histories, scientific writings, speeches, and commentaries. A commentary is a text that explains another text, often line by line, like a quiet conversation across time. There may also have been works of grammar, medicine, mathematics, and records useful to the city or court. Ancient libraries were often mixed in this way, preserving both literature and practical knowledge. Pergamon is especially remembered for its association with parchment. Parchment is a writing material made from prepared animal skin, usually from sheep, goats, or calves. The skin was cleaned, stretched, scraped, dried, and smoothed until it became a pale surface suitable for writing. The process required skill and patience. One can imagine the careful scraping, the stretching frame, the slow polishing, and then the finished sheet, strong enough to be used and handled again. It is important not to say that Pergamon invented parchment from nothing. Prepared animal skins had been used for writing before, but Pergamon became so closely linked with this material that the word parchment itself is connected with the city's name through Greek and Latin terms. In this way, Pergamon gave its name to a surface that would become deeply important in the long history of books. An ancient Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, tells a story about how parchment developed at Pergamon. According to this tradition, Egypt restricted the export of papyrus, and Pergamon, needing another writing material for its library, turned to prepared skins. The story is memorable, and it may preserve some echo of competition between great centers of learning. but historians do not treat it as secure proof. It is better to hear it as an ancient explanation, a tale about materials, ambition, and adaptation, rather than as a simple fact. Papyrus and parchment were different in texture and use. Papyrus, made from the papyrus plant of the Nile, was light, smooth, and well-suited to scrolls. It carried the memory of reeds, riverbanks, and Egyptian workshops. Parchment was heavier and more durable. It tolerated folding better than papyrus. In later centuries, parchment would be especially useful for the codex, an early book form with pages, more like the books familiar today. A codex could be opened to a place in the middle more easily than a scroll, and its pages could be gathered, sewn, and protected between covers. But parchment did not quickly replace papyrus. The two materials lived side by side for centuries. In some regions and for some purposes, papyrus remained common. In other settings, parchment became preferred. The history of writing materials is rarely a sudden change. It is more like a long table where many surfaces rest together. Clay, papyrus, parchment, wood, leaf, silk, and paper, each useful in its own way. In Pergamon, one may imagine scholars walking through shaded spaces, carrying scrolls or sheets beneath folded cloth. The city's terraces would have held the warmth of the sun, while interior rooms offered cooler air. Wooden cupboards and chests protected text from dust and handling. A reader might open a case, lift down a scroll, and read aloud in a measured voice. Another might compare two copies, noting small differences. A scribe might prepare a fresh copy on parchment, the letters forming slowly across the smooth surface. Libraries needed more than texts. They needed buildings, storage, trained workers, writing materials, and people who knew how to find, read, copy, and explain what was kept there. They needed patronage, the support of rulers or wealthy benefactors. They needed time, they needed quiet attention. The later fate of Pergamon's library is uncertain. Ancient sources tell stories, including one that Mark Antony gave its books to Cleopatra, but such claims are debated. Like many ancient collections, Pergamon's library has come down to us through scattered references, partial memories, and the broader traces of the city's cultural life. Its shelves are no longer there as they once were, yet its name remains connected to one of the great materials of written history. And so Pergamon offers a gentle lesson in the material life of knowledge. Ideas do not float through time by themselves. They rest on surfaces. They are pressed into clay, brushed onto silk, drawn onto papyrus, written on parchment. They depend on hands that prepare, copy, fold, roll, label, and preserve. As the light fades over the hillside city, papyrus and parchment rest side by side in their wooden cases. One is born of river reeds, the other of patient craft and smoothing. Together they remind us that the keeping of memory has many forms. From this quiet room in Pergamon, the view widens again toward the broader Greek and Hellenistic world, where teachers, students, philosophers, and travelers carried texts from place to place. Chapter 7. Libraries of Greece and the Hellenistic World. In a shaded walkway, where olive leaves shift gently above pale stone, a few low voices move through the afternoon air. Sandals stir soft dust along the path. A teacher pauses beside a column, and a student holds a papyrus scroll with both hands, unrolling it slowly until the needed lines appear. The words are not kept in silence alone. They are read aloud in a measured tone, shared with listening ears, and then folded into conversation. In ancient Greece, knowledge lived first and always in voices. Long before books became common possessions, poems, histories, laws, and teachings were carried by memory and performance. Singers recited epic poetry. Citizens listened to speeches. Students learned by hearing, repeating, questioning, and discussing. Writing did not replace this oral culture. Instead, writing came to rest beside it like a quiet companion. Greek texts were often written on papyrus scrolls. Papyrus, made from the pith of a reed, could be rolled into a long cylinder and tied with a cord. A reader did not open it like a modern book. The reader held the roll, unrolled one side, and rolled up the other, moving gradually across the columns of writing. The codex, an early book form with pages, would become more common later. In the classical and Hellenistic Greek world, the scroll remained the familiar shape of the written word. Book collections existed, but they were not usually public lending libraries in the modern sense. Literacy was not universal, and access to books often depended on wealth, status, education, and place. Many collections belonged to scholars, philosophers, elite households, schools, or royal courts. A collection might rest in wooden chests, in cupboards, or in wall niches. Some scrolls were marked with small labels, so a reader could identify them while they were still rolled. The room might be simple, with shelves and cases, or part of a larger house or school, where text supported teaching rather than standing apart from daily life. In Athens, philosophy gave books a special kind of companionship. Plato's academy was not a library in the modern sense, but a school and community of inquiry. There, thought moved through dialogue, careful speech, and shared questions. Written texts mattered, yet the living exchange between teacher and student mattered deeply too. A scroll might preserve an argument, but a conversation could unfold it. Aristotle's Lyceum offered another image of learning. The Lyceum was Aristotle's school in Athens. Later writers associate Aristotle with a notable collection of books, perhaps a private or school library. The exact history of this collection is uncertain, because the surviving accounts were written later and may preserve a mixture of fact, memory, and story. Still, the association is meaningful. Aristotle and his students studied animals, plants, poetry, politics, logic, ethics, and the heavens. For such wide inquiry, texts could serve as tools of comparison and memory. A scroll could hold a poem, a list of constitutions, a record of observations, or the thoughts of earlier teachers. In these schools, reading was often done aloud. A student might recite a passage, and another might answer. A teacher might pause over a line and ask what it meant. The voice gave shape to the text. The ear helped the mind follow it. Even when a person read alone, the habit of sound was close to the page. Ancient reading often had a social quality, woven into instruction, discussion, and recitation. As Greek culture spread after the conquest of Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic world took shape. Hellenistic means the period after Alexander, when Greek language and culture became influential across kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and parts of Western Asia. Rulers supported scholars and artists through patronage, which means giving money, protection, buildings, or positions to encourage learning and culture. Royal patronage helped book collections grow. A king who gathered scholars also needed scrolls. A court that welcomed poets, physicians, mathematicians, and historians needed texts to compare, copy, and preserve. In these settings, books were signs of learning and prestige, but they were also working tools. Scholars compared different versions of poems. Grammarians studied language. Historians gathered accounts of the past. Physicians and astronomers consulted earlier writings while adding new observations of their own. Books moved quietly through many routes. A teacher might bring scrolls from one city to another. A student might copy a text during study. A traveler might purchase a roll from a bookseller. A family might pass a collection by inheritance. A scholar might borrow a text long enough to have it copied by a trained hand. Each copy could carry a work farther, though copying also required care, because mistakes could enter as easily as preservation. A line skipped, a word changed, or a marginal note misunderstood could alter a text. For this reason, careful readers compared copies when they could. The book trade grew in some Greek cities, especially where educated readers gathered. Yet books remained costly compared with ordinary goods, because each one had to be written by hand. A single scroll represented the labor of preparing material, copying words, checking the text, and storing it safely. Behind every collection stood many patient hands, scribes, teachers, students, sellers, owners, and readers. Not every Greek library was large. Some were small, perhaps only a chest of treasured scrolls in a philosopher's house. Others belonged to schools, where they helped preserve the words of founders and earlier thinkers. Still others were part of wider Hellenistic ambitions, supported by kings who wished their cities to shine with learning. The forms differed, but the purpose was often similar: to give memory a place to rest, and to make thought available for the next conversation. Imagine, then, a quiet courtyard near evening. The heat of the day has softened. A student finishes reading a passage aloud, and the teacher lets the words settle. The papyrus is rolled again with gentle care. Its cord is tied. Its label rests near the outer edge. For now, the scroll returns to its chest or niche, but its journey is not finished. In time, copies will move westward, carried by merchants, scholars, soldiers, and families, into Roman houses and villas, into forums and baths, into public collections where Greek and Latin words will stand side by side. The lesson ends softly, but the text continues on. Chapter 8. Rome. Villas, forums, and public libraries. In a shaded Roman room, the floor is cool beneath the afternoon light, and the walls are lined with quiet cupboards. Inside them rest scrolls, each rolled around a slender rod, each marked with a small label, so that a reader may know what words are waiting within. Beyond the doorway, a garden courtyard holds a little square of sky, a basin of still water, and the soft green of leaves. The room is not hurried. It is a place for voices, memory, and careful attention. Roman book culture grew from many roots. The Romans inherited much from the Greek world, especially as Rome's contact with Greek cities deepened through travel, trade, conquest, and education. Greek literature, philosophy, drama, history, and science became highly valued among Roman elites. A wealthy Roman might collect both Greek and Latin books, placing them in a private library as signs of learning, taste, and social standing. These books were usually not books with pages in the modern sense. They were scrolls, most often made of papyrus. A scroll could be stored in a round box, a wooden chest, a cupboard, a wall niche, or a cabinet. Sometimes the ends of scrolls carried small tags, called labels, that named the author or the work. A reader would take down a scroll, unroll it carefully with both hands, and move through the text column by column. In Roman houses and villas, a library could be a separate room or a carefully arranged part of a larger suite. A villa was a country house or estate, often belonging to a wealthy family. Some villas had rooms for dining, rooms for receiving guests, baths, gardens, and shaded walks. A library in such a place might look out toward a courtyard or terrace, where the sounds of water and leaves softened the day. Yet most Roman homes did not contain such collections. Books were costly, literacy was not universal. Access to education depended on wealth, status, gender, place, and family circumstances. The libraries we hear most about belonged largely to the elite, because elite houses, inscriptions, and literary references have left the strongest traces behind. One of the most remarkable surviving Roman private libraries comes from Herculaneum, a town near the Bay of Naples. There, in a grand house now called the Villa of the Papyri, archaeologists found a large collection of ancient scrolls. The villa was buried during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. The heat carbonized many of the scrolls, turning them dark and fragile. This preservation was unusual and accidental. The Villa of the Papyri was not an ordinary example of every Roman library, but it gives a rare glimpse of a private collection that might otherwise have vanished completely. Roman literary life was often spoken aloud. Reading silently did happen, but reading aloud and recitation were important parts of culture. A recitation was a public or private reading of a work, often before friends, patrons, or invited listeners. A poet might read new verses, a historian might share a passage, a student might practice a speech. In such moments, a text became a voice in the room, measured and shaped by breath. Behind many Roman books stood the labor of trained writers. Copying and book production often relied on enslaved people and freed persons. A freed person was someone who had formerly been enslaved and then legally freed. Some enslaved and freed workers were highly literate. They copied texts, took dictation, maintained household records, taught children, organized collections, and helped produce books for sale or private use. This was skilled work, but it existed within a society marked by deep inequality. To remember Roman libraries honestly is also to remember the hands that copied, sorted, carried, and cared for texts under conditions not freely chosen. As Rome's book culture expanded, libraries also appeared in civic and imperial spaces. A forum was a public square or civic center, surrounded by buildings where political, legal, religious, and social life took place. In the late Republic and the imperial period, Rome began to develop public libraries. These were not public in the modern sense of open, equal access for all people. Their use depended on status, literacy, location, custom, and opportunity. Still, they marked an important development. Collections of books supported by powerful patrons and placed within the public life of the city. The first public library in Rome is usually credited to Asinius Pollio, around 39 BCE. Pollio was a soldier, politician, writer, and patron of literature. His library was remembered as a significant beginning in Rome's civic book culture. After him, Augustus, Rome's first emperor, supported libraries as part of the city's cultural and architectural life. Later emperors continued this pattern, founding or maintaining libraries in connection with temples, porticos, baths, and other public buildings. Roman public libraries often had separate Greek and Latin sections. This arrangement reflected the bilingual world of educated Roman culture. Greek texts carried the prestige of an older literary and philosophical tradition, while Latin literature had grown into a rich body of poetry, history, rhetoric, law, and commentary. In one part of a library, scrolls of Homer, Plato, or Greek historians might rest in their cases. In another, Latin works by Roman poets, orators, and scholars might be arranged in order. The architecture of these libraries could be graceful and orderly. There might be a reading room with niches in the walls, cupboards for scrolls, statues of authors, and spaces where readers could sit or stand with a text. Some libraries were connected with gardens or colonnades, where shaded walkways offered room for conversation. The Roman love of architecture gave books a setting of marble, wood, painted walls, and measured proportions. In the great baths of Rome, too, libraries could be part of a larger world of public amenities. Bath complexes were not only places for washing. They could include exercise areas, gardens, lecture spaces, and rooms for reading. A person with the right access might move from a courtyard to a hall, from conversation to a scroll, from warm stone to a quiet cabinet of texts. Still, the ancient Roman library remained different from a modern lending library. Scrolls were not usually borrowed by anyone who wished. Collections were shaped by patronage, prestige, education, and social rank. Many people encountered texts by hearing them read aloud, rather than by taking scrolls into their own hands. Knowledge moved through rooms, voices, teachers, patrons, households, and professional copyists. As evening settles over the imagined city, the scrolls return to their places. Greek and Latin works rest in separate cupboards, their labels hanging neatly from their ends. A reader's voice fades in a marble room cooled by shade. Beyond the walls, the roads of the world continue outward, not in one simple line, but in many widening paths. From Rome, our attention can drift eastward, toward other ancient ways of keeping memory, toward recited verses, palm leaves, birch bark, monasteries, courts, and the long manuscript traditions of India. Chapter 9. Ancient Libraries of India. In a shaded hall, where the warm air rests gently beneath a high roof, a teacher's voice begins a measured recitation. Around him, students listen with careful attention. The words move in a steady pattern, rising and returning, each sound shaped with precision. Before a hand reaches for a manuscript, before ink touches leaf or bark, knowledge is already being kept in another kind of library, the trained memory. In ancient India, learning was strongly oral as well as written. Many important teachings were preserved by speaking and listening, by repeating and remembering, sometimes for many generations. The Vedas, a body of ancient Sanskrit sacred texts, were cared for in this way with extraordinary discipline. A Veda was not simply remembered loosely, it was recited according to rules of sound, rhythm, and order, so that each syllable could be passed on with great care. Recitation means careful spoken repetition. In many traditions of ancient India, recitation was itself a form of preservation. A student might learn a passage by listening again and again, repeating it back, and gradually holding it within memory. In this way, sound became a vessel for knowledge. The voice carried what a shelf might carry in another culture. The mind became a quiet room where words could rest. Yet writing also had an important place. Across South Asia, manuscripts were made from materials suited to local landscapes and customs. A manuscript is a handwritten text. In many regions, one of the most common forms was the palm leaf manuscript. Palm leaves were dried, trimmed, smoothed, and cut into long, narrow pages. A scribe could write across the surface in dark ink, and the leaves were often pierced with 1 or 2 holes so that a cord could pass through them. When gathered together, the leaves formed a slender bundle, sometimes protected by wooden boards and wrapped in cloth. One may imagine the making of such a manuscript in an unhurried way. The leaves are selected and prepared. Their surfaces are made even beneath patient hands. The scribe sits with ink nearby, writing line after line on the long pale strips, The letters follow the length of the leaf. When the writing is finished and dried, the leaves are placed in order. A cord passes through them, keeping the text together. Then the manuscript is wrapped, perhaps labeled, and placed in a chest, on a shelf, or in a quiet study space. In northern and northwestern regions, birch bark was also used. Birch bark is the thin layered bark of the birch tree, and it could provide a writing surface with a delicate texture. Some birch bark manuscripts have survived in dry or protected conditions, though many others have disappeared. Cloth, wood, and other materials could also be used in certain contexts. As in many ancient cultures, the material of writing shaped the life of the text. Palm leaf, bark, cloth, and wood each required its own care. The climate of much of South Asia made preservation difficult. Heat, humidity, insects, and wear could damage manuscripts. Palm leaves in particular often needed to be recopied when they grew old or brittle. Because of this, many ancient Indian texts are older than the surviving manuscripts that preserve them. A poem, a teaching, a medical treatise, or a work of grammar might have been composed centuries before the particular copy that has come down to us. The old words survived because they were recited, studied, and copied again. Written collections were found in many kinds of places, though not always in the form of a modern public library. Monasteries could keep manuscripts for study and ritual. Temples might preserve religious texts, instructions, hymns, and records. Courts supported poets, scholars, physicians, and teachers, and manuscripts could gather around such learned communities. Scholarly households also played a role, with families and teachers preserving texts across generations. Centers of teaching may have held collections for students and masters, though the evidence is often fragmentary and should be approached with care. The subjects preserved were wide and rich. There were religious and philosophical texts exploring the nature of reality, duty, liberation, and devotion. There were works of grammar, including highly refined studies of language. There were writings on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, ritual, poetry, and drama. Some texts offered rules for ceremonies. Others explained the body, the stars, numbers, sound, or poetic expression. Some were memorized aloud, some were copied onto leaves or bark. Many lived in both forms at once. Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical communities all contributed to the preservation of manuscripts and learning. Buddhist monasteries kept and copied teachings, commentaries, and philosophical works. Jain communities developed strong manuscript traditions, preserving scriptures, stories, cosmological writings, and works of learning. Brahmanical scholars maintained Vedic recitation, ritual texts, grammar, law, philosophy, poetry, and many other forms of knowledge. These traditions were not the same, and each had its own practices, languages, and centers of study. Yet each shared in the patient work of carrying words forward. One later flowering of monastic learning was Nalanda, founded around the 5th century CE during the Gupta period. Nalanda became a major Buddhist monastic institution, especially in the centuries that followed. It is best understood here not as the beginning of Indian libraries, but as part of a long and developing world of teaching, recitation, manuscript copying, and scholarly exchange. In such places, learning gathered in halls, courtyards, cells, and storerooms. Manuscripts rested near voices. Debate and memorization lived alongside the written page. Because so much has been lost, the ancient libraries of India must be imagined with humility. Many collections have vanished without leaving shelves or catalogs behind. Others survive only through later copies, quotations, or references in other works. The absence of a manuscript does not mean the absence of learning. Sometimes knowledge was held in sound. Sometimes it was written on fragile leaves. Sometimes it passed quietly from teacher to student, from one careful generation to the next. As evening softens the edges of the study hall, the recitation comes to a gentle close. A palm leaf manuscript is wrapped in cloth and placed back in its chest. A birch bark text rests in careful protection. The words are not only on the page, they are also in memory, in practice, and in the patient voices that have carried them. From these shaded rooms and listening halls, the path of ancient libraries turns farther east, toward bamboo slips, silk manuscripts, brushwork, lacquered boxes, and the ordered archives of ancient China. Chapter 10. China. Bamboo, Silk, and Imperial Archives. In a quiet room of polished wood and packed earth, a bundle of bamboo slicks rests inside a lacquered box. Lacquer is a smooth, glossy coating made from tree resin, used to protect wood and other surfaces. The box opens with care. Inside, narrow strips of bamboo lie side by side, each one marked with dark brushstrokes. When the bundle is lifted, the slips touch one another with a small, dry sound, like reeds moving softly in a gentle wind. Ancient China developed rich traditions of keeping records. Some collections were archives, places where official documents were stored. Some belonged to courts, temples, or scholars. Some were gathered for government work, and others for study, teaching, ritual, or the preservation of older writings. As in other ancient lands, these were not always libraries in the modern public sense. They were often ordered spaces of administration and learning, where texts were kept because rulers, officials, and scholars needed to return to them. Early Chinese writing appears on what are called oracle bones. An oracle bone is an animal bone or turtle shell used in divination, a practice of asking questions about the future or about ritual matters. During the Shang dynasty, questions were inscribed on these bones and shells. Heat was applied, cracks appeared, and specialists interpreted the patterns. The inscriptions might ask about harvests, weather, royal journeys, illness, or ceremonies. They were practical, sacred, and official all at once. These oracle bones were not library books, yet they show an early habit of recording words in a durable form. They preserve names, questions, dates, and concerns from a distant courtly world. Their surfaces are hard and pale, and the writing on them is often fine and deliberate. In them one can sense the beginning of a long Chinese tradition of written memory, records made for use, then kept, and sometimes discovered again after centuries of silence. Before paper became common, many Chinese texts were written on bamboo or wooden slips. A bamboo slip was a narrow strip of bamboo, smoothed and prepared for writing. Characters were brushed in vertical columns, and the slips could be tied together with cords to make a longer text. A reader might unroll or unfold the bundle by loosening the cords, then follow the columns from slip to slip. Such books had weight and texture. They were not pages in the later sense, but joined pieces, flexible enough to be handled and strong enough to endure careful use. Wooden slips were also used, especially for documents, labels, letters, and official records. In dry or sealed places, some have survived with remarkable clarity. They tell of government administration, military postings, legal rules, taxes, supplies, and messages sent across long distances. The ancient archive in this setting was not only a place of poems and classics, commands, inventories, reports, and accounts, the steady written work by which a large state remembered its own actions. Silk, too, served as a writing material. It was smooth, light, and elegant, but also expensive. Because of its cost, silk was often reserved for important manuscripts or special uses. A brush moving across silk left a flowing line, and the surface could hold diagrams, maps, philosophical texts, medical writings, and ritual works. Unlike bamboo, silk could be folded or rolled more lightly. It belonged to another kind of quietness, soft, costly, and delicate. One of the most important discoveries of ancient silk manuscripts came from the Mawangdui tombs, dating to the early Han period. There, archaeologists found texts written on silk, including works on philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and other subjects. Some differed from later versions of well-known writings, reminding us that ancient texts often existed in more than one form. A text might change slightly as it was copied, arranged, edited, or transmitted. The manuscript found in a tomb may preserve one moment in a long journey, like a footprint left in fine dust. Paper eventually became one of China's great contributions to the keeping of texts, but its story should be told gently and accurately. It is often said that paper was invented in 105 CE by Cai Lun, an official at the Eastern Han court. More carefully, we can say that paper existed before that date in some forms, and Cai Lun is credited with improving or reporting paper-making methods to the court. Over time, paper became increasingly important because it was lighter than bamboo and less costly than silk. Yet one material did not instantly replace another. Bamboo, wood, silk, and paper overlapped for generations. Different texts, offices, regions, and purposes could use different writing surfaces. In this way, ancient Chinese libraries and archives were material landscapes. One shelf might hold tied bundles of slips. Another might contain silk manuscripts in a protective wrapping. A later collection might include paper documents stacked in order. Knowledge rested not in an abstract cloud, but in things that could be touched, tied, carried, copied, and stored. Imperial archives preserved many kinds of writings. There were laws and administrative records, histories and classical texts, ritual writings, technical treatises, calendars, and scholarly works. The court needed records to govern. Scholars needed older texts to study and compare. Ritual specialists needed instructions and precedents. Historians needed documents from earlier reigns. The archive was therefore a working memory for the state, a place where the past could be consulted with care. The Qin dynasty is remembered partly for the suppression of some texts and scholars, an episode described most fully by later Han sources. It was an important moment in Chinese cultural memory, but it was not the whole story. Afterward, especially under the Han dynasty, there was also recovery, collection, editing, and classification. Texts were gathered, versions were compared, titles were listed. Scholars tried to understand what had survived, what belonged together, and how writings should be arranged. Two Han scholars, Liu Shang and his son Liu Xin, are especially associated with major cataloging and textual editing projects. A catalog is an organized list of texts, made so that people can know what a collection contains and how it is arranged. Liu Shang examined imperial holdings, compared manuscripts, edited texts, and prepared summaries. Liu Xin continued this work and is connected with the Qilu, or seven summaries, an important bibliographic classification. Though the original work does not survive complete in its earliest form, later traditions preserve its influence. It helped shape the idea that texts could be grouped into categories. Such classification was a quiet but powerful act. To place a text in a category was to give it a home among other writings. It helped scholars find what they needed. It helped officials understand the range of a collection. It also preserved the names of works, including some that later disappeared. Sometimes a catalog is like a shadow library, holding the memory of books no longer present. Imagine a Han scholar at the end of the day. Before him lies an older manuscript, perhaps copied on bamboo slips, with a cord loosened and the strips set in order. Beside it is another version, similar but not identical. He reads slowly, compares phrases, notes differences, and chooses how to record them. His brush moves with patience. A small dish of ink darkens the tip. The room is still except for the faint contact of bamboo, silk, wood, and hand. When the work is done, the scholar ties the slips again. The cord gathers separate pieces into one text. The bundle is returned to its box, and the box to its place among other ordered things. Around it rest laws, histories, rituals, poems, calendars, and treatises, each one part of a larger keeping of memory. From here, the path of the story widens again. Across many lands, the work has been different in material, language, and custom, yet familiar in its patience. Copying, repairing, classifying, translating, teaching, storing. A tablet is placed on a shelf. A scroll is tied with a label. A palm leaf manuscript is wrapped in cloth. A bamboo bundle is returned to order. In each quiet act, knowledge is carried a little farther along. Chapter 11. Preserving Knowledge Across Time. In a quiet room, after the day's work has softened, a worn manuscript might rest beside a fresh sheet. The older text carries the marks of use. A darkened edge, a loosened cord, a place where many fingers have turned or unrolled it. Nearby, new ink dries slowly in the still air. One copy has given its words to another, and in that simple act, knowledge has moved a little farther through time. Ancient libraries and archives did not survive by stillness alone. They survived through repeated human effort. Clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, parchment sheets, palm leaf manuscripts, bamboo slips, silk writings, and early paper all needed care in their own ways. Some had to be kept dry, some had to be wrapped, some needed cords, labels, boxes, shelves, jars, or niches. Some needed to be copied again before they became too faded or fragile to read. This was preservation as active work, not passive storage. A library was not only a place where texts rested, it was also a place where careful hands returned to them again and again. A scribe might begin with an exemplar. An exemplar is the copy from which another copy is made. It might be a tablet placed beside a lump of damp clay, or a papyrus roll open next to a new roll, or a palm leaf manuscript laid carefully near fresh prepared leaves. The scribe would look, write, pause, and look again. Line by line, sign by sign, the older words entered a new body. Sometimes this work was practical and ordinary. A legal record might be copied, so it could be kept in more than one place. A ritual text might be renewed for temple use. A school exercise might train a young writer in proper signs, words, and forms. In Mesopotamia, students copied lexical lists, organized word lists used for learning and reference. In Egypt, scribes practiced letters, accounts, hymns, and wisdom texts. In China, scholars compared versions of classics and histories. Across many lands, learning passed through hands that repeated, corrected, and preserved. Copying could protect a text, but it could also change it. A tired eye might skip a line, a sign might be misunderstood, a word might be replaced by a more familiar one. Sometimes a later scribe added a note, a correction, or an explanation. For this reason, scholars compared one version with another. They checked differences and tried to understand which reading seemed older, clearer, or more reliable. This long movement of a text through many copies is called textual transmission. It means the way words are carried from one copy, one reader, and one generation to the next. In some ancient libraries, people also practice classification. Classification means arranging things into groups so they can be found again. A tablet might belong to a series of omen texts, a group of hymns, or a set of royal records. A scroll might be placed with poetry, medicine, grammar, or astronomy. A bamboo manuscript might be stored with histories or ritual writings. The systems were not all the same, and they were not modern library systems, but they shared a patient purpose: to make memory retrievable. Labels helped. A scroll could have a small tag tied to it showing the title or author. A clay tablet might have a colophon, a note giving details such as the scribe, owner, or place in a series. A manuscript bundle might be wrapped in cloth, named, and placed on a shelf. In some rooms, tablets were arranged by subject or function. In others, documents were grouped by office, owner, transaction, or date. Even simple order was a form of care. Catalogs carried this work a step further. A catalog is an organized list of texts. It does not preserve the whole book or tablet, but it can preserve a name. Ancient catalogs sometimes tell us of works that no longer survive. A title may remain like a small lamp after the text itself has disappeared. It reminds us that ancient libraries once held more than archaeology can now show. Translation was another way knowledge traveled. Translation means carrying a text from one language into another. In Hellenistic Alexandria, scholars worked in a world of Greek learning and many older traditions, and translation helped texts move between communities. In large empires, multilingual administration required records and messages to cross languages. Later, as Buddhist texts moved across Asia, translation became a central act of preservation and teaching, allowing scriptures and commentaries to take new forms in new places. A translated text was not merely a copy, it was a bridge. Libraries also needed support beyond the writing table. They depended on political support from rulers, religious support from temples and monasteries, economic resources, and trained labor. Someone had to provide materials: clay, reeds, ink, skins, leaves, bamboo, silk, or paper. Someone had to feed and house scholars, scribes, teachers, and caretakers. Someone had to value the work enough to let it continue. Many texts survived because they were copied repeatedly. A hymn used in worship, a medical recipe consulted by practitioners, a grammar taught to students, a story loved by readers, or a law needed by officials might be renewed again and again. Repetition gave such texts many chances to endure, yet survival also depended on chance. Dry climates helped papyrus last. Burial sometimes protected manuscripts from weather and hands. Fire could destroy, but in some cases, it hardened clay tablets or carbonized scrolls in a way that allowed traces to remain. Popularity helped some works continue, while others vanished, though they were once respected. Institutional support preserved many texts, but accidents preserved others. The ancient record that reaches us is therefore uneven, shaped by care, climate, use, neglect, and fortune. Across cultures, the same quiet pattern appears. A worn edge is repaired, a bundle is tied again, a tablet is brushed free of dust, a scroll is returned to its pigeonhole, a small compartment where it can rest in order. A teacher guides a student's hand in making signs, or a student's voice in careful recitation. The patient work of copying becomes knowledge carried from one generation to another. No single person could hold all of this memory alone. It required communities of careful hands, scribes, librarians, scholars, translators, teachers, patrons, monks, priests, officials, artisans, and readers. Together, often without knowing what distant future they served, they made small shelters against forgetting. And so, in many rooms across many centuries, texts came to rest, tablets on shelves, scrolls in cases, manuscripts wrapped in cloth, bamboo slips tied with cord, silk folded gently, paper stacked in quiet order. Each material had its own weight and texture. Each carried words forward in its own way. From these many rooms, the story moves toward a wider legacy, where clay, papyrus, parchment, palm leaf, bamboo, silk, paper, and modern books can be imagined together, resting in the long calm of remembered knowledge. Chapter 12. The Quiet Legacy of Ancient Libraries. In a quiet room, long after the day's footsteps have faded, shelves can seem almost to breathe, not loudly and not in any ordinary way, but with the soft presence of many lives gathered together. A book rests beside another book. A label waits on a spine. A catalog holds names in careful order. Somewhere a record is kept so that it may be found again. This simple act, placing memory where it can be cared for, is very old. The libraries and archives of the ancient world were not all alike. Some belonged to temples, some to palaces, some to schools, courts, monasteries, or private households. Many were not public spaces in the way a modern library may be. Some held poetry and philosophy. Others held tax accounts, legal decisions, land records, medical recipes, astronomical observations, prayers, hymns, or lists of words for students to learn. Yet beneath their differences was a shared human concern: how to gather what matters, how to arrange it, and how to pass it onward. Modern libraries inherit some of these ancient concerns, though not from one single beginning. There is no one straight road from Nineveh, Alexandria, Pergamon, Rome, India, or China into the libraries of today. The legacy is broader and more winding than that. Later medieval, Islamic, monastic, imperial, university, private, and public library traditions all shaped the long story. Each added its own rooms, its own habits, its own ways of caring for knowledge. Still, when a librarian collects a book, arranges a shelf, preserves a fragile page, creates a catalog entry, or helps a reader find a path through many possibilities, something ancient is quietly present. The work is not exactly the same as that of a Mesopotamian scribe, an Egyptian temple scholar, a Han cataloger, or a Roman copyist, but it belongs to the same wide family of patient tasks. It is the careful keeping of memory. The remains of ancient libraries and archives have given modern scholars many windows into the past. History depends on them, because old records tell us names of rulers and merchants, prices of grain, treaties, letters, and ordinary concerns written down by careful hands. Literature depends on them, because poems, epics, plays, and stories survived by being copied, stored, and copied again. Astronomy depends on ancient observations of stars, planets, calendars, and eclipses. Medicine has learned from old prescriptions, case notes, anatomical ideas, and healing traditions, even when modern knowledge has moved far beyond them. Law, too, has been shaped by preserved tablets, inscriptions, scrolls, and manuscripts, which show how earlier societies imagined justice, property, duty, and agreement. Linguistics, the study of language, relies on ancient writing to understand how words changed across time and how scripts developed. Religious studies draws from hymns, ritual texts, commentaries, sacred stories, and prayers that rested for centuries in temples, caves, monasteries, and archives. Even a small receipt, a school exercise, or a broken tablet can become important because it carries a trace of how people lived and thought. Ancient libraries also remind us that knowledge is material. It is easy today to think of information as weightless, moving through invisible signals and glowing screens. Yet even digital media depends on physical things: servers, wires, energy, minerals, and carefully maintained systems. In earlier times, the material nature of knowledge was more visible to the hand and eye. In Mesopotamia, words rested on clay. A scribe pressed a reed stylus into a damp tablet, leaving wedge-shaped marks called cuneiform. Some tablets dried in the sun, some were fired, some were hardened by chance and survived when other materials disappeared. In Egypt, words flowed over reed papyrus, made from the papyrus plant that grew beside the Nile. Strips were layered, pressed, dried, and smoothed, becoming pale sheets that could be joined into scrolls. In Pergamon and across the Mediterranean world, parchment offered another surface. Prepared animal skin, scraped and stretched into a smooth, durable sheet. In South Asia, manuscripts could be written on palm leaves, long and narrow, pierced for a cord, and wrapped in cloth, or on delicate birch bark with its layered texture. In China, texts were brushed onto bamboo and wooden slips, tied together with cords, or written on silk and later on paper, which would gradually transform writing cultures far beyond its place of origin. Clay, reed, skin, leaf, bark, bamboo, silk, paper, and now digital storage. Each material shaped what could be written, how it could be carried, how it could be stored, and how long it might last. A clay tablet could endure for millennia, but was heavy. Papyrus was light and graceful, but fragile outside dry climates. Palm leaf could be beautifully prepared, yet needed recopying as time and insects took their slow toll. Paper was light and flexible, but also vulnerable to damp, flame, and wear. Every library has always been a meeting place between memory and material. The survival of ancient texts is uneven. This is one of the quiet truths of the past. Some famous works, praised by ancient writers, have vanished. We know them only by title, by a short quotation, or by the mention of someone who once read them. Some books that were admired for centuries are gone, while ordinary records survived in great numbers because they were written on durable clay, sealed away in dry ground, or preserved by accident. A list of sheep, a tax account, a letter about a shipment of goods, or a student's word list may outlast a celebrated poem. This does not mean the ordinary record was more loved. It means that survival depends on many things: climate, material, copying, storage, popularity, neglect, burial, reuse, and chance. Some works survived because communities valued them deeply and copied them again and again. Others survived because they were forgotten in places where the earth kept them safe. Catalogs, too, carry a tender kind of memory. A catalog is an organized list of texts, and sometimes catalogs preserve the names of works that no longer exist. They are like quiet shelves made of words. They tell us that a book was once known, once stored, once part of a larger order. Even when the text itself has disappeared, its title can remain like a small lamp seen from far away. This unevenness does not diminish the legacy of ancient libraries. It makes it more human. Libraries have never been perfect containers for everything. They are made by people, and people must choose, copy, repair, arrange, fund, protect, and teach. They work within the limits of their time. They depend on institutions, climates, materials, and the steady attention of caretakers. They also depend on readers, because a text that is never read, taught, or copied may become quiet in another way. Across centuries, the work of preservation has often been active rather than passive. A scribe compared one exemplar, or model copy, with another. A scholar corrected a line. A monk repaired a worn edge. A court official listed documents by subject. A teacher guided a student through recitation. A translator carried words from one language into another, making them available to new communities. A family wrapped manuscripts in cloth and placed them on a shelf. A librarian created order where there might otherwise have been a heap of beautiful confusion. The ancient world teaches that memory is not kept by stone buildings alone. It is kept by habits. It is kept by attention. It is kept by hands that return a scroll to its place, by voices that repeat a sacred verse accurately, by brushstrokes moving in steady columns, by labels tied to the ends of rolls, by cords threaded through palm leaves, by tablets set in order, by names entered into lists. And so the ancient library is not only a place, it is also a practice. Today, when someone walks into a library, opens an archive, searches a catalog, reads a digitized manuscript, or studies a fragment of an old tablet, they take part in a long and varied inheritance. It is not a simple inheritance from one culture to another, but a wide pattern of care. Many peoples in many places discovered that memory could be gathered, arranged, and shared. They did this for different reasons and in different ways. Some sought wisdom, some served kings, some preserved ritual, some taught students, some managed land, trade, or law, some loved poetry, some watched the stars. All of them left traces. Now imagine gently a final library beyond any single time or city. It is not a real ancient building, but a quiet room of thought where the materials of many centuries rest together. Moonlight lies softly across the shelves. Clay tablets sit low and steady, their wedge-shaped marks holding old accounts, old hymns, and old stories. Nearby, papyrus scrolls are rolled and tied, pale as river reeds in dry air. Parchment leaves rest in soft shadow, smooth and patient. Palm leaf manuscripts lie wrapped in cloth, their cords still holding narrow pages in order. Birch bark waits in delicate layers. Bamboo slips are bundled neatly, their cords loose enough for careful opening. Silk manuscripts seem almost to hold the moonlight. Paper books stand quietly beside them, and somewhere unseen, digital memory hums in its own distant way. Nothing in this room needs to hurry. Each surface has carried words as far as it could. Each has been touched by careful hands. Each has offered a small shelter against forgetting. The room is still, but not empty. It holds the presence of scribes, scholars, readers, teachers, translators, catalogers, caretakers, and all those who once leaned close to a line of writing and found meaning there. It holds ordinary records and treasured poems, known works and lost titles, clear voices and faint traces. It holds the long human wish to remember, to understand, and to share. And in that quiet companionship, the story of ancient library settles into rest, clay beside reed, parchment beside leaf, bamboo beside paper, every material carrying what it could across the river of time. Memory has not been kept perfectly, it has been kept patiently, it has been cared for in fragments, in copies, in lists, in songs, in shelves, and in the steady hope that something worth knowing may still be found again.